would like to take you through a little history to essentially make my case that if you were to pick one time to be born and one place to be born, and you didn't know what your sex was going to be, you didn't know what your intelligence would be, you didn't know what your special talents or special deficiencies would be, that if you could do that one time, you would not pick 1720, you would not pick 1820, you would not pick 1920. You'd pick today, and you would pick America. And of course, the interesting thing about it is that ever since America was organized in 1789, when George Washington took the oath of office, people have wanted to come here. Can you imagine that? For 231 years, there's always been people that have wanted to come here. Now, my friend, I think has jumped the gun just a shade on putting up slide one, but I'm going to call from some slides as we go along. But the interesting thing about this country is what is on slide one. Let's put it up. And this is an extraordinarily young country. Now, I'm comparing it to a couple of guys that are pretty old, but when you think about the fact that my age, Charlie's age, or our life experience, and then we'll throw in this young guy over here, Greg Abel, and if our life experiences combined exceed the life of the United States, we are a very, very young country. But what we've accomplished is miraculous. Now, just think of this little spot in history. And if we'll go to slide 2, I've tried to estimate. Well, let's go back and we'll stay with slide 2. But the population in 1790, we had 3.9 million people here. Incidentally, when you look up census figures, you find out that they had a big fire in the Department of Commerce building in 1921, so they lost a lot of the census records. So these are not quite as, there's some things where there's a few gaps. But there were 3.9 million people in the United States. And actually, I've got 0.6 million. It's closer to 0.7 million. There were 700,000 of those people were slaves at the time. But those 3.9 million people were 1/2 of the population of the planet. And if you'd asked any of those 3.9 million people, any of them, to imagine what life would be like 231 years later, even the most optimistic person, and they could have been drinking heavily and even had a little pot, and they still could not in their wildest dreams have thought that in 3 lifetimes, Charlie's, mine, and Greg's, that in that period, you would be looking at a country with 280 million vehicles shuffling around its roads. Airplanes, maybe not today so much, but they'll be back again. And they were flying people at 40,000 feet, coast to coast in 5 hours. That great universities would exist in one state after another, great hospital systems, and entertainment would be delivered to people in a way nobody could have dreamt of in 1790s. This country, in 231 years, has exceeded anybody's dreams. I went to the internet and trying to prepare for this, and I tried, if you'll move to the next slide, I tried to find out what was the wealth of the country in 1789, our starting point. And I punched in United States, wealth. I tried 1789, I tried 1790. I thought it might be a little easier in terms of a round year. And I think 4 million or so references came up. And I didn't look at all 4 million, but I can tell you the data collection in those early days on many fronts was not anything like today. You really can't find what I would consider reliable figures. You can find out how many mules there were in the country and a few things like that, and trying to add them up. But in real estate, when you're looking at houses or apartment houses or office buildings, that they're each slightly different than each other, but they look to comparable sales. So it's hard to find a lot of countries that have been sold where the wealth has been estimated. But it was interesting to go back and think about the fact that in 1803, we purchased for $15 million. We made the Louisiana Purchase. Now that's a little later than 1789, but that's the best comp, as they say in real estate. That's the best comp we could find for land mass anyway. And when we made that purchase, that was equal, incidentally, to about a quarter, about 800,000 plus square miles. But it was about a quarter of what the lower 48 states now contain. So we bought about a quarter of the lower 48 for this $15 million back in 1803. And if you live in Texas and your grandfather is close to dying, and he calls the children around him, and in his final words, he always says, "Don't sell the mineral rights." Well, the French sold us the mineral rights on that $15 million deal as well. So we got that whole strip there. We got all of Kansas and essentially all of Oklahoma, and they produced 21 billion barrels of oil for us and a lot of natural gas since the purchase. One of the sidelights is that we paid our $15 million for the Louisiana Purchase. We paid $3 million of it, 20% of it. We paid with 200,000 ounces of gold, valued at $15 an ounce, and that $3 million that the French took. And we got South Dakota as part of the Louisiana Purchase, and the Home State mine up there, before it closed, produced well over 40 million ounces of gold, and 40 million ounces of gold, and comes to about $60 billion worth. And like I say, 200,000 ounces took care of 20% of our purchase price. So the Louisiana Purchase was a bargain, but it's what the going price was for 800,000 square miles, I guess, at the time, and 3 cents an acre. And so I decided, by playing around with various numbers such as that it, as a reasonable estimate of the worth of the country in 1789, $1 billion was not a crazy figure. Now, if I'd been an academician or something, I would have put $1,107,400,000 or something like that. Or I would have made it look respectable, but it's a wild guess. But it's not It's not a crazy figure. So what has happened? Let's move on to the next slide. To the wealth of the country since then. And here we have some figures that come out pretty regularly. Well, they do come out regularly, where the Federal Reserve estimates the net household worth of people in the United States, all the households in the United States. And you can look these up, and you'll see that there's 30 trillion of stocks, and I think maybe single-family homes. There's 82 million or so owner-occupied single families, and maybe 45 million rental apartments, and so on. So you start adding all these up, and the Federal Reserve tells us, and I invite you to look at the data. It's kind of interesting that we now in the United States, 231 years later, we have 100 trillion. We have more than 100 trillion of household wealth, even though the stock market's gone down somewhat since the last quarterly report. So you say, well, we've had a lot of inflation and everything. We actually, in the United States, for the first half of our existence, roughly, we didn't really have that much inflation. We had inflationary periods and deflationary periods, but the general price level did not change that dramatically. But I will assume again for this calculation that there's been 20-for-1 inflation. It's way less than that in many commodities, but it's very hard to measure and talk about equivalent benefits from different kinds of products and so on, and costs. But I think it's reasonable to say that the United States, in real terms, has increased in wealth. That's something in the area of 5,000 for one, which is really, it's mind-blowing. 5,000 for one in real terms in a country that had 0.5% had a bunch of raw land. But a vision that to accomplish that in 231 years, there's just no denying that's beyond what anybody could have dreamt earlier. But it was not done, and this is important, because we've now hit a bump in the road. It was not done without some very, very serious bumps in the road. It was not 231 years of steady progress. As a matter of fact, we had been in this birth of this country, we'd been, into it 72 years, and if we go to the next slide, 1861, we now had about 31 million people. With the 1960 census showed around 31 million people or thereabouts in the country, and 4 million of them were slaves, and we had never really resolved the very much unfinished business of what was involved in compromises in 1789, and we'll have more to say about that later. But we had something that not too many countries experience, and if you told people in 1789 that in 72 years you were going to have a division that caused the President of the United States at Gettysburg to say that testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. Imagine the President of the United States wondering aloud whether the country that he was presiding over could long endure. Only 72 years, or 74 years at Gettysburg, had taken place. So while this marvelous dream was being played out, roughly a third of the way through it, we faced this really moment of decision, and we entered into a contest that, if we'll go to the next slide, we made an estimate that literally killed roughly 6% of the males in the country who were between 18 and 60. I'm assuming that there were more than 600,000 deaths in the war, and I think it's a reasonable estimate that 18 to 60 group was males were by far the great proportion. So imagine 6% of your working prime age males in the country are wiped out in 4 years. So when we look at the progress of this country and we think of our own problems now, I just ask you to ponder, and we'll move to the next slide. That would be equivalent today to having 4 billion males in that same age group similarly wiped out. So that was one incredible interruption, which this country nevertheless worked through while compiling this American dream that is one of the wonders of the world, perhaps the wonder of the world in many senses. So let's move on to another crisis of a different sort that hit the country. And this, of course, is the 1929 crash, which led to the Great Depression. And here, the Dow Jones average, which we'll use through this, at that time, that's the one everybody paid attention to. Actually, the second most important average at that time, if you look at the papers, was the New York Times average, which has disappeared. And, of course, the Standard & Poor's has probably regarded as a superior yardstick. But the Dow Jones is a perfectly adequate yardstick. And on September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones average closed at 381.17, and people were very happy, and buying stocks on margin had worked wonderfully. And the Roaring '20s had a good feeling to it with the auto coming of age and the day of air travel coming along and all kinds of new appliances and the telephone getting wider use, believe it or not. It hadn't really caught on that much prior thereto, but the movies were coming on. It was a happy place. And then, of course, if we'll move to the next slide, we'll look at what happened in the couple of months after September 3rd. And the Dow Jones average almost got cut in half. And that was pretty impressive until we had this recent situation where in a shorter period of time, we lost about a third. But the crash, and there's a great book about it called The Great Crash by John Kenneth Galbraith. Let me interject one little plug here. There's a small business in Omaha, and I hate what truncating this meeting or changing it so dramatically has done to many of the businesses in Omaha, because I think small businesses were the beneficiaries of a really they got a lot of business with the Berkshire meeting, and they're going to get it in the future. But they suffered during a period like this, and they just had a story about the bookworm. Well, the bookworm, if you buy any books that come out of anything I recommend, think about just put in bookworm in Omaha, And The Great Crash is a wonderful book, and John Galbraith describes it. But I would like to get into a bit of a personal note, which will have some relevance, not too much, but some relevance to the story of the Great Depression, because in 1929, my dad, who was 26 years of age then, was employed as a security salesman by a local small bank. And he sold stocks and bonds, but he sold stocks. And when stocks fall 48%, and you were selling them to people a few months ago, you really don't feel like going out and facing those same people. So I think my dad probably elected to do, as they say now, shelter in place, which means stay at home. And there really wasn't that much in our house. We just had a small yard. It was wintertime anyway. My dad wouldn't have been puttering around the yard anyway. And there really wasn't, television wasn't there. And he and my mother got along very well. So under those conditions, if you'll turn to the next slide, I was born about 9 months later. So, but at that time, I was actually born on August 30th, but the stock market was closed that day, and so I'm using the previous day figures. But it wasn't. I didn't notice at the time that the market was closed, but the stock market had actually recovered over 20% during that 9.5 month period or thereabouts. People did not think in the fall of 1930, they did not think they were in a Great Depression. They thought it was a recession, very much like had occurred at least a dozen times, although not always when stock markets were important. But we'd had many recessions in the United States over the time, and this did not look like it was something dramatically out of the ordinary. And for a while, actually for about 10 days after my birth, that view held on, and the stock market actually managed to go up all of 1 or 2% there in those 10 days. But that's the last day. Well, from that point, if you'll turn to the next slide, the stock market went from a level of 240 to 41, which was a noticeable decline, because if somebody had given me $1,000 on the day I was born and I'd bought stocks with it and bought the Dow average, my $1,000 would have become $170 in less than 2 years. And that is something that none of us ever experienced. That we may have had it with one stock occasionally, but in terms of having a broad range of America marked down 83% in 2 years, and marked down 89% of the peak that was in September 3rd, 1929, was extraordinary. And in that intervening period, less than 1 year after I was born, just slightly less than 1 year, my dad went to the bank where he worked and had his account, and of course, the bank had a sign on it closed, and so he had no job. And he had 2 kids at that point, and his father had a grocery store, but Charlie and I both worked for my grandfather. Charlie worked there in 1940. I worked there in 1941, so we didn't know each other. But my grandfather said to my father that, don't worry about your groceries, Howard. He says, I'll just let your bill run. That was, my grandfather was not exactly. He he cared about his family, but he wasn't going to go crazy. One of the things as I look back on that period is, and I don't think economists generally like to give it that much of a point of importance, but if we'd had the FDIC 10 years earlier, the FDIC started on January 1st, 1934. It was part of the sweeping legislation that took place when Roosevelt came in. But if we'd had the FDIC, we would have had a much different experience, I believe, in the Great Depression. People blame it on Smoot Hawley, and there's all kinds of things, and the margin requirements in '29, and all of those things entered into creating a recession. But if you have over 4,000 banks fail, that's 4,000 local experiences where people save and save and save and put their money away, and then someday they reach for it and it's gone. And that happens, in all 48 states, and it happens to your neighbors, and it happens to your relatives. It has to have an effect on the psyche that's incredible. So one very, very, very good thing that came out of the Depression, in my view, is the FDIC, and it would have been a somewhat different world, I'm sure, if the bank failures hadn't just rolled across this country, and with people that thought that they were savers found out that they had nothing when they went there, and there was a sign that said closed. Incidentally, the FDIC, I think very few people know this, but or at least they don't appreciate it, but the FDIC has not cost the American taxpayer a dime. I mean, its expenses have been paid, its losses have been paid, all through assessments on banks. It's been a mutual insurance company of the banks, backed by the federal government and associated with the federal government. But now it holds $100 billion, and that consists of premiums that were paid in and investment income on the premiums, less the expenses and paying of all the losses. And think of the incredible amount of peace of mind that's given to people that were not similarly situated in when the Great Depression hit. So the Great Depression went on, and it lasted a very long time, but it lasted a lot longer in the minds of people than it did actually in its effects. World War II came along, and on sort of an involuntary manner, we adopted Keynesianism. We started running fiscal deficits, of course, that were absolutely huge, and took our debt up to a percentage of GDP, which we've never reached, had never reached before, and never have reached since. So we had an enormous economic recovery, but the minds of people had been so scarred, the memories. Parents told their children. 1929 became a symbol in people's minds. I mean, if you said 1929, it was like saying 1776 or 1492. I mean, everybody knew exactly what you were talking about, and it affected stock prices in a rather remarkable way, to the point, if you'll change to the next slide, it was January 4th of 1951 that the kid who was born on August 30th in 1930 had finished college before the stock market got back to where it was at that earlier time. So take the years from 1930, or 1929, really, to 1951, or take the year from my birth, 20 years, and bear in mind that the country was only 140 years old when this started. That's 20 years out of this amazing 231-year lifetime of our country that was flat out, a time for a long time of no economic growth and no feeling by people in terms about the wealth of the country, about what the American economy was worth, what all these corporations that were doing far, far, far better than they were long ago. But it took all of that time to restore in the market a price level that was equal to what it was when I was born 20 years earlier. So if you think about the fact that we're enduring a few months, and we'll endure many more months, but and we don't know how it comes out. And people in the 30s didn't know how it was going to come out, but they endured, persevered, prospered, and the American miracle continued. But it's interesting in that I actually don't have a slide for the next one, because last night I was thinking, after all the slides had been prepared, I was actually thinking about this a little bit, and I remembered that at the start of 1954, the stock market the Dow was only at about 280. And I remember 1954 because it was the best year I ever had in the stock market. And the Dow went from essentially 280 or thereabouts at the start of the year to a little over 400 at the end of the year. And when it went to 400, as soon as when it crossed 381, that famous figure from 1929, when it went to 400, this will be hard for some of you to believe, but everybody wondered, is this 1929 all over again? And that seems a little far-fetched, because it was a different country in 1954. But that was the common question, and it actually achieved. It achieved such a level of worry about whether we were about to jump off another cliff, just because the 381 of 1929 had been exceeded, that they held Senator Bill Fulbright of Arkansas, who became very famous later in terms of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he headed the Senate Banking Committee, and he called for a special investigation, and he called it the stock market study. But it really, if you read through it, he really was questioning whether we had built another house of cards again. And on his committee, it's interesting to see the Senate Finance Committee, one of the members was Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, and grandfather of George W. Bush, and had some illustrious names. And his committee, in March of 1955, with the Dow at 405, assembled 20 of the best minds in the United States to testify as to whether we were going crazy again, because the market was at 400, the Dow was at 400, and we'd gotten in this incredible trouble before. But that was the mindset of the country. It's incredible. We didn't really believe America was what it was. And my boss, the reason I'm familiar with this 1,000-page book that I have here, I found it last night in the library and everything, was that I was working in New York for one of the 20 people that was called down to testify before Senator Fulbright. And he testified right before Bill Martin, who was running the Federal Reserve, testified, and right after General Wood, who was running Sears, testified. Sears was very, very important then. And Bill Martin, of course, is the fellow that the longest running chairman in the history of the Fed, and he's the one that gave the famous quote about the function of the Fed was to take away the punch bowls just when the party started to get really warmed up. But Ben Graham, my boss, sent me over to the public library in New York and to gather some information for him. Something you could do in 5 minutes with a computer now, and I dug out something, and he went to testify. And on page 545 of this book, I knew where to look. I didn't have to go through it all, but he had the quote which I remember. And I remember because Ben Graham was one of the three smartest people I've met in my life, and he was the dean of people in securities business. He wrote the classic security analysis book in 1934. He wrote the book that changed my life, The Intelligent Investor, in 1949. He was unbelievably smart. And when he testified with the Dow at 404, he had one line in there right toward the start in his written testimony, and he said, the stock market is high, looks high, it is high, but it's not as high as it looks. But he said it is high. And since that time, if we'll turn to the next slide, of course, we felt the American tailwind at full force, and the Dow, well, let's see, when the Dow went down Friday, but when we made the slide, it was about 24,000. So you're looking at a market today that has produced $100 for every dollar. All you had to believe in America and just buy a cross section of America. You didn't have to read the Wall Street Journal. You didn't have to look up the price of your stock. You didn't have to pay a lot of money in fees to anybody. You just had to believe that the American miracle was intact. But you'd had this testing period between 1929 and really, certainly 1954 is indicated by what happened when it got back up to 380. You had this testing period, and people really, they'd lost faith to some degree. They just didn't see the potential of what America could do. And we found that nothing can stop America when you get right down to it. And it's been true all along. It may have been interrupted with the scariest of scenarios when you had a war with one group of states fighting another group of states. And it may have been tested again in the Great Depression, and it may be tested now to some degree. But in the end, the answer is never bet against America. And that, in my view, is as true today as it was in 1789, and even was true during the Civil War and the depths of the Depression. Now, I'm now about to say something that and don't change the slide yet, but I'm now about to say something that some of you will be tempted to argue with me about, but I would make the case that we are imperfect in a great, great, great many ways, but I would say, and if you'll put up the next slide, that we are now a better country as well as an incredibly more wealthy country than we were in 1789. We're far, far, far from what we should be, will be, but we have gone dramatically in the right direction. It's interesting. We said in 1776, he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their creative with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." And yet, 14 years later, a year after we really officially began the country in 1789, adopted a constitution, we found that more than 15% of the people in the country were slaves. And we wrestled with that. But when you say the word self-evident, that sort of sounds like you're saying any damn fool can recognize that. And you certainly say, you can argue maybe a little bit about life and the pursuit of happiness, but I don't see how in the world anybody can reconcile liberty with the idea that 15% of the population was enslaved. And it took us a long time to at least partially correct that. The economy took a civil war. It took losing 6% of those people, that males that were between 18 and 60 years of age. But we've moved in the right direction. We've got a long ways to go, but we've moved in the right direction now. In addition, going back again to that 1776 statement that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator, etc. I think it was self-evident to the 50% of the population that they were getting a fair deal for over half the lifetime of the country. It took 131 years of our country's 231 years. It took 131 years until women were guaranteed the right to vote for our country's leaders. And then what's even more remarkable is that after we adopted the 19th Amendment in 1920, it took 61 more years until a woman was allowed to join those 8 males on the Supreme Court. I grew up thinking that the Supreme Court, must have been said it had to be 9 men, but it 61 years, so it took 192 years before Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed to the court. And now you can say that there was a pipeline problem. Half the population may have been women in 1920, but they weren't half the lawyers, or they weren't 10% of the lawyers probably. So you can understand some delay, but 61 years is a long time to go and to pick 33 males in between. If that was entirely by chance, then the odds against that, if you were flipping coins, is about 8 billion to 1. Now, like I said, there was a pipeline problem. But it took us a long, long time. And it's not done yet. But I think it does give meaning to the fact that we are a better society with a lot of room to go. But we are a better society than existed in 1789. When you go to Colonial Williamsburg, you have that. I've been there a couple of times. As a matter of fact, I watched the debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford there. That's in 1976, and it was not a great time to be black. It was not a great time to be a woman, and both of those categories still have certainly got potential for significant improvement in terms of fulfilling that pledge made in 1776 about how we believe that it's self-evident that all men are created equal. But we have made progress. We are a better society, and we will, as the years go by. If you'll move to the next slide. And I believe that. And I think, let's see if I can get these slides in the proper order here. I believe that when you get through evaluating all of the qualitative facts, what we have done toward meeting the aspirations of what we wrote in 1776. What we wrote in 1776 wasn't a fact, but it was an aspirational document, and we have worked toward those aspirations, and we have a long way to go. But I'll repeat, if you'll move to the next slide, that never bet against America. Now, let's move on now to a much broader subject, what I don't know. And I don't know, and perhaps with a bias, I don't believe anybody knows what the market is going to do tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. I know America is going to move forward over time, but I don't know for sure. And we learned this on September 10th, 2001, and we learned it a few months ago in terms of the virus. Anything can happen in terms of markets. And if you can bet on America, but you have to be careful about how you bet, because simply because markets can do anything. On October, whatever it was, in 1987, October 11th, I believe, Monday, markets went down 22% in one day. In 1914, they closed the stock market for about 4 months. After 9/11, closed the market for 4 days. We hustled to get it going again. But nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So when you bet, I tell you to bet on America, and I tell you that that's what's really gotten me through ever since I bought my first stock when I was 11. I mean, I caught a huge tailwind in America, but it wasn't going to blow in my direction every single day, and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I would like to, in the context of the present news, point out something you may find kind of interesting. If you go to YouTube, you'll find on June 17th of 2015, 4+ years ago, you'll find Sam Nunn, who's one of the people I admire the most in the United States, in the world, enormous patriot, tremendous senator, and he's carried on thankless work since leaving the Senate, and I'd say heading something called the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which most of you haven't heard of, but I've been slightly involved in it. Sam Nunn founded that. And the Nuclear Threat Initiative is simply organizations devoted to trying to reduce the chances of something of a nuclear, chemical, biological, and now cyber nature from either malevolent or accidental or whatever it may be, from causing deaths to millions of Americans, and among the things, Sam co-founded it, but he's been the heart and soul of the organization subsequently, and he's talked about, worried about pandemics along with the nuclear threat for decades, and he's participated in war games where they play out various scenarios, including malevolent pandemics that could be appeared on this YouTube presentation, and I'm sure he's been on many others. I just happened to look this one up, and talked about the dangers of a pandemic, and anybody should listen to Sam on any time he talks. So he said at that time, germs don't have borders, which we've certainly learned in the last couple of months. And when I clicked on YouTube, if you'll go to the next, I found out that it had 831 views, and this was only a few days ago. I looked it up, and maybe, I don't know whether most of those views have just been the last few days, or the last few months, I should say, because of the interest in pandemics. But it is hard to think about things that haven't happened yet, and so we can experience, when something like the current pandemic happens, it's hard to factor that in, and that's why you never want to use borrowed money, and at least in my view, in margin to buy into investments.